Hi, I'm going to talk about asymmetries in whole body task execution in a change of direction maneuver after anterior cruciate ligament reconstruction. The majority of ACL ruptures are non-contact, and changing direction while running is the single task that's associated with the highest proportion of these ruptures. This type of change of direction maneuver involves two components fundamentally: deflection of the center of mass heading angle, which is changing the direction that the center of mass is traveling in, and rotating the body to reorient it towards the new direction of travel. Joint level biomechanical differences associated with altered knee loading have been found when turns from the ACL reconstructed leg are compared with turning off the non-operated leg at the time of return to sport. These asymmetries have been discussed in the literature in the context of potential explanations for the increased re-injury risk we know these athletes have, and also in the context of approaches for objective monitoring of rehabilitation and return to sport decision making. However, we know that running speed and change of direction angle themselves are major determinants of knee loading during the movement. There's a reasonably extensive literature showing that an increase in either factor is associated with increased braking impulses and knee frontal and sagittal plane moments. If approach speed and change of direction angles differ when cutting off the operated and non-operated legs, between limb asymmetries in joint mechanics after ACL reconstruction would therefore be expected to reflect this non-equivalence in the actual task that's being completed, rather than being solely indicative of different movement patterns within an identical task. So they'd need to be interpreted in that context. King et al. Reported in 2018 that approach speed was lower when turning off the operated leg than off the non-operated leg 9 months after ACL reconstruction, but we don't know whether there's also an asymmetry in change of direction angle. The aim of this study was therefore to investigate asymmetries in whole body change of direction task execution 9 months after ACL reconstruction, which is around the time of return to sport. We hypothesized that post-ACL reconstruction athletes would reduce both center of mass heading angle deflection and body rotation components during the stance phase of the change of direction step when they were cutting from the operated limb in comparison to the non-operated limb. So 144 male multi-directional field sport athletes participated in the study. It was part of a larger project. All participants had undergone primary ACL reconstruction with either a bone patella tendon bone or a hamstrings tendon autograft 8 to 10 months previously, and all had stated prior to surgery that they intended to fully return to multi-directional sport. Anyone who'd had a previous ACL reconstruction on either limb or had concurrent multiple ligament reconstructions was excluded. So the participants did a standardized warm-up of jogging, squats and jumps, and then they did some single and double leg jump tasks as part of clinical testing and another research study. Then they performed the change of direction task. So this is the task here. So it involved running straight down the middle of the lab, through a timing gate 2 meters from the force platform, changing direction on the force platform in front of the mannequin, cutting off the outside leg, and then running through a second gate that was positioned 2 meters away at 90 degrees from the first gate. They were asked to complete the task as quickly as possible, and they did 3 trials in each direction, following 2 practice trials in each direction. All trials turning off the non-operated leg were collected first. So we calculated center of mass heading angle, thorax rotation angle, and pelvis rotation angle at the start and the end of the change of direction step stance phase, so we could report both the angles at initial contact here, and also the total change in the angles during stance phase, which is here. We also calculated centre of mass velocity in the horizontal plane at initial contact, although interlimb differences in this variable have already been published by our group in an overlapping patient cohort. Paired student t-tests were used to compare cuts off the non-operated leg with cuts off the operated leg for these variables. Results. So focusing first on the instant of touchdown, we found that centre of mass velocity at initial contact was lower when turning off the operated leg than when they were turning off the non-operated leg. Centre of mass heading angle was more oriented towards the new direction of travel at initial contact when turning off the operated leg, but both the pelvis and the thorax segments were less oriented towards the new direction of travel. If we look at what happened during the change of direction stance phase itself, there was less deflection of centre of mass heading angle during stance when they were turning off the operated leg, but there was no evidence for differences in the total rotation of either pelvis or thorax. So this is a summary here of the effects that we observed. What's interesting to note is that the centre of mass heading angle at toe off, the exit angle, was almost identical for the two directions. The mean difference was less than 1.5 degrees because the reduced centre of mass heading angle change during stance phase on the operated leg was almost entirely compensated for by the increased heading angle at initial contact. We also saw that same trade-off in the variability between participants themselves. So this graph shows the relationship between the centre of mass heading angle at initial contact on the injured leg on the x-axis and the change in centre of mass heading angle during stance on the y-axis. And you can see that those participants who were travelling more in the new intended direction of travel at initial contact were also those who had the least change in heading angle during stance. So in conclusion, we found that systematic asymmetries in whole body change of direction task execution are indeed present around the time of return to sport after ACL reconstruction. So this might need to be borne in mind when interpreting joint level differences between limbs. The differences in velocity and the apparent trade-off between centre of mass heading angle at initial contact and deflection of centre of mass heading angle during stance suggests that what might be going on here is that people are using feed-forward control during the approach to modulate lower limb loading in the change of direction step. There are known deficits in strength and in knee flexor external moments across various tasks after ACL reconstruction. So we would expect our participants' ability and confidence tolerating high loads on the reconstructed leg to be reduced. And the lower approach speeds and smaller change of direction angles, like we saw here, are associated with lower braking forces and lower knee flexor external moments. So therefore, it could be the case that the participants manipulated the demands of the task during the approach to make it easier on the operated limb, so they could still achieve only trivial interlimb differences in exit angles and achieve the task. As the final point, it's important to note that all the differences that we identified were relatively small. So if we go back to the results table here, you can see we're talking about interlimb differences in angles where we detected differences in the region 2.5 to 4.5 degrees, small to moderate Cohen's d effect sizes. For context, they're about the same as the differences that have been published between body angles for planned versus reactive change of direction, or differences between centre of mass heading angle change for changing direction at 2 meters a second versus 3 meters a second. The next question for us to answer is therefore whether these differences are big enough to have clinically meaningful effects on joint level mechanics that would need to be considered when interpreting interlimb differences. So that's a focus of future work. Thank you for listening. I'd like to acknowledge the Sports Surgery Clinic Sports Medicine team and particularly the biomechanics team for assisting with data collection and processing for this study.